Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Legends of Sport podcast. I'm your host, Andy Bernstein. So today's guest might not be a household name to everybody, but the company he worked for definitely is. Our guest is Scott Reames, and for 29 years, Scott worked for a company called Nike. Scott became the Nike historian, so much so that when Nike co-founder Phil Knight was writing his book Shoe Dog, he actually had to go to Scott to get all the details and some of the facts and backstories and anecdotes that he might have forgotten over the years that made Nike what it's become, worldwide giant in athletic footwear and everything else that we have known and loved with Nike for years and years and years. So Scott, incredible guy, very much in the background, but is the authority on everything Nike. And we had a great conversation. We talked about some amazing stories about how Nike was founded. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. He had some wonderful anecdotes, and I was thrilled to be able to sit down and have a great conversation with Scott Reames. Big thanks to Scott's longtime colleague over at Nike, Mark Tomashow. Mark is a great friend and former podcast guest. So thank you, Mark, for making that happen. And hopefully everyone will enjoy this as much as I did. And as always, I'll see you guys on the backside. I want to welcome Scott Reames to the Legends of Sport podcast. How are you,
Thanks
Scott?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. So, Scott, where are you and how is retirement going?
I am in the office of my home in Southwest Portland.
Very nice. And so you retired from Nike when? Like in the spring? Oh, no, I'm sorry, in the fall, right?
No, October 1st of 2021.
Okay, great. So right
20,
in the middle of the depths of the pandemic, right?
yeah, it was one of those pretty much anticlimactic retirements, right? I mean, I hadn't been in my office really since March of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So the last 18 months or so of my career were essentially spent right here in my office in my house in Southwest Portland. So
crazy.
my last day of the work was essentially to go in to Nike, take my laptop, a couple other documents and things, turn them in to some security person, sign a piece of paper, say thank you. And then I basically decided as long as I'm here, I'll walk around the campus. So I walked around the campus one last time, got in my car and I thought, well, there it is.
Yeah. It must have been so strange for you, after spending so much time there and seeing everything grow from the beginning, basically. What a strange existence. Same thing for me. I mean, I luckily had my office here to escape to. I had my wife is a lawyer. She was doing her lawyering from home. I had an eighth grader. I have a kid in grad school. Everybody's using up Zoom,
Yes.
So I had a place to escape, but every once in a while I'd have to drive somewhere, and I drive past what used to be called Staples Center, which I live at basically.
Sure.
Ghost town. I mean, just what a strange existence. So hopefully everybody, yourself included, and your family, have been healthy and avoiding this crazy variant, and trying to start the new year healthy.
We're knocking on wood, but it's getting closer and closer and closer. So
Yeah.
I'm afraid. I mean, we've been boosted, we've been vaccinated, we've done everything we can do. We wear the masks. So at some point, it's just going to be the luck of the draw. So
yeah, I know, I hear you. And I just talked to my daughter in Philly. She got hit, so it is going to be what it's going to be. But luckily it's not like 2020 where it could actually kill you. So
right. Because I take sniffles and a headache and a fever for a couple of days. That's a nice trade-off.
Exactly, I hear you. So Scott, first of all, like I said, we never met, but I've heard so much about you from our good friend Mark Tomashow, and I was so intrigued by the article I read that Terry Lefton wrote in Sports Business Journal, and it's right up our alley here at Legends of Sport. Somebody like you who essentially has flown under the radar of sports personalities, but it's so integral to everything in that end of the business. It's just great to connect with you, and I'm so looking forward to just you sharing some stories with us today.
I'm looking forward to it too. For whatever reason, I mean, it's fine. Nike has its own. It decides what's important. It's not. They never wanted to really publicize or do anything about the archives or my
Yeah.
role. And so when I would meet people on an airplane or something like that, and I tell them what I do, they look at it and they go, "Really?" I say, "Yeah." They go, "That sounds like one of the coolest jobs ever." And I'm like,
Right.
"It is." And I wish I could tell you more. And I talk on the plane, but I never could do interviews. So once I retired, I'm like, I can talk to anybody I want to.
That's funny. So you were kind of like an NBA referee. Like you were like out of sight, out of mind, anonymous.
Right.
You're like walking the earth, but you can't talk to anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and our archive, as it is right now, is set up purely for internal, for employee purposes. Right. We don't have a museum.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I guess I should stop saying we at some point, but that'll probably never happen. But
Right.
Nike doesn't have a museum. The archive itself is not open to general drop-in from the public. I mean, employees even have to make an appointment, and this is a non-COVID era. They would even have to make an appointment because the whole building's in lockdown, and there's a lot of valuable items there. So we don't just have it open as a drop-in.
Yeah.
So even within the Nike community, we were somewhat of a mystery slash what's going on in there kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
And the mystique was kind of cool, but I also felt like, gosh, I wish we could open this up to a lot more people.
Yeah, it's kind of like the secret room in the CIA. It's like, what's going on over there?
Yes.
So Scott, on the podcast, I always like to find out where the guest started, where like everything began. And, we did a lot of research about you. My crack researcher, Veronica, was, not a lot of info on you, my friend out there. So she had to do a lot of work, to figure out what where you started. But I understand that your family was in the shoe business. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm a third generation shoe dog, if you will. My grandfather, my mother's father, actually had a small shoe store in East St. Louis back in the 1930s, and then moved into Brown Shoe Company, which is based in St. Louis. Then my father started working at Brown. I've never actually asked him if it was through my grandfather, through his father-in-law, or if it was a happenstance thing, because my dad was more of design and architectural design. So it's a very different discipline from what my grandfather's doing, because my grandfather was in international shipping and things like that. So it's hard to believe that they would have interacted much. I don't know. It's one of those questions now I'm like, shoot, I should have asked him that, because unfortunately he passed away a few years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they both were in the shoe business. And then my father moved us from St. Louis to Eugene, Oregon in 1976, because he got an offer from a company called Osaga Shoe Company, which is at the time in the mid 70s was on a somewhat similar trajectory as this also brand new company called Nike. Sadly, my dad's horse was not the one that won the race. So Osaga lasted for about another 5 or 6 years into the early 80s. And of course, Nike is what it is today. I fell in love with Eugene and with Oregon. So I ended up, instead of moving back to the Midwest, when my parents did after Osaka went under, I decided to stay in Oregon and went to the University of Oregon. Fell in love with a native Oregonian, married her. So it's just all of a sudden my future and my present and future will be in the state of Oregon. And then that ultimately led me, after a series of, I don't know how deep you want to go, but after a series of smaller interim jobs, into the Nike world in 1992.
Right. And you worked first in PR at Nike. Is that right? No,
it's funny. It's actually, that's where I applied. I wanted to be in the PR department at Nike. That was my degree at the University of Oregon.
Yeah.
But they sent me a nice note back. I wish I would have saved it. Basically like, thanks, but get some experience first. So I ended up actually moving back to St. Louis for just a brief stint to work for an agency called Fleshman Hillard.
Sure.
Which at the time was up and growing. Now it's actually, I understand, one of the larger agencies in the world.
Yeah.
But I worked there for a couple of years. I was on the Valvoline account, and the only reason I'm sharing all this is because it leads to the pattern. So I was on the Valvoline account, including their motorsports team. So I was asked to do PR for Top Fuel drag racing, which I love sports, but to me, motorsports and drag racing was not exactly on the top 15 pages of things I would like to do for sports PR.
Right.
But I did it. Because I wanted to be employed, and I got experience in the motorsports world. And when I finally realized I was kind of tired of doing that type of PR, I don't like to be PR for hire. I like to work for a company that I really believe in. I'd worked for the YMCA in college and really enjoyed what I did there. So my wife wasn't too thrilled with Missouri. She's again native Oregonian. So
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, she was getting her master's degree at Washington University in St. Louis. And I said, well, when you get close to graduating, why don't we look for careers elsewhere, including the Northwest? And then I ended up actually getting a job offer for a small event company in Portland
Mm-hmm.
that did motorsports. So again, it wasn't exactly my first love, but it got me a good entryway or foot in the door back in Portland.
Yeah.
So I did that for a year and a half and did a bunch of events in both Oktoberfest, motorsports here. It was, again, not a first love, but I started meeting people. I started meeting people at Nike.
Uh-huh.
And I was a friend of mine, mutual friend of my wife's, actually, it turned out, told me that they were looking to hire at Nike because they had opened up Nike Towns in Portland and Chicago. And they were looking for a hybrid position as somebody who could do marketing, PR, and events in the store. Well, thanks to my little sojourn to St. Louis and to the event company, I was the only applicant that could show that he had experience in all three of those areas. And so I got the job. So that's why when I asked to do like high school guidance, I said, sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So I ended up getting a job at Nike in 92, but not in PR, right? So that would come 5 years later. I would do a couple other jobs and move into PR. So that's the long version of how I end up getting into PR finally at Nike, but not through the front door.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, all our paths, to our careers all took different routes, of course, but it isn't a straight line. I don't know anybody who actually has a career that was a straight line. Maybe maybe LeBron James is went from high school to being a Hall of Fame player, but so you're at Nike, right? And somehow I got to hear this story about how you created DNA, the
Sure.
Department of Nike Archives. Could you share that?
Absolutely. So I've been with Nike for, let's say, I started in 92. So this is about 10 years later, 2002, 2003. I was then in the global brand communications department, which had just been formed. And so that was the responsibility there. Was we worked with Phil Knight and Mark Parker and all the senior leaders of the company. And we would do the business calls, the earnings calls, et cetera. And then if there were media interviews that needed to be done, I would facilitate about half of them. And there was another person that did the other half. But one of my people was Phil. And so I would facilitate a lot of Phil's interviews, and I would listen to him talk about the early days and the founding of the company and the swoosh and how much he paid. And I noticed that it would change occasionally. It was $50, it was $35, it was $75, and other little, nothing gigantic, but just little niggling things. It's like, that's not what we said last time, And so I started making notes, and then I started talking to a couple of my friends who are in design, and they were complaining that they were having some of the same issues. Was there were the same great stories, but they were the same ones. They just kept being rehashed, and they kept saying there must be other stories, there must be other people, there must be other pools we can drink from, if you will, because designers are always looking for that resource that they can really jump into. So all these things started spinning in my head, and I just started realizing that what we had was a great archive. We've always had an archive back into the 70s, and they've got some amazing things in it. But what there was missing was the stories behind the items. Most of what we had in the archive was essentially the description of it was whatever post-it note or whatever was attached to whoever gave it to us, right? So it was purely the memory of that one person without any reference or any fact checking, really. So all this came together, and I put together a proposal. And I'm kind of a wordsmith, so I did come up with DNA, Department of Nike Archives, because they were called Archives and Records, which is very accurate. That's what they did. But I'm like, can't we punch that up a little bit?
Yeah, a little technical.
So we put together a proposal, and I ran it by a couple of folks at Nike, and I wanted to run it up through the food chain, like we're supposed to do. And one of the people I talked to is named Nelson Ferris, and he's like the longest tenured employee. He's actually turning 49 years at Nike in about a week or so.
Wow. And
so he looks at it, and he goes, "Scotty, my boy, we got to take this right up to Phil." And I said, "Well, I got to run it by so-and-so." He goes, No. We'll take it to Phil. We'll take it to Phil. So he calls Phil in Phil's office, and like in a day or two, we've got a lunch meeting with Phil.
Yeah.
So I'm frantically trying to put together the proposal and finish all this, shave off it and make everything good. And so we have the lunch, and I present it to Phil, and Phil kind of looks at it, and he goes, Yeah. There's some. I can see something here, but it's going to be not just you. You're going to be like six people in a budget of $2.5 or $3 million. And there's like this pregnant pause as Phil is so good at, and he goes, "And you're not going to get that." But then he said, "But let me think about it." And so a few months later, I got a call from the director of the archive, the person who oversees the archives,
Uh-huh.
and he said, "I understand you had a conversation with Phil." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we have a job. We got the approval for a head count. And if you're interested, the job is yours." And it took me about a nanosecond to say, yes, I would be interested. And
Yeah.
that was in early or mid 2004. And then I straddled the two jobs because Phil then announced that he was going to step down as CEO at the end of 2004. So since I was his PR person, they wanted me to stay on. So I kind of I carried him through that. I mean, I didn't carry him through, but I did the publicity for him through that. And then once he had stepped down, then I stepped full time into the historian role in 2005.
Interesting. So, as you're talking about this, I'm remembering I worked for the Dodgers in the mid '80s to the mid '90s, and one day somebody in PR said to me, "Andy, I got to show you something." And we go down to floor like 3.5 of the Dodger state. Literally, it's not even an elevator that goes there. You got to go down the stairs, and you can relate to this. And there's this room that's lit by like one bulb, and it's got crap in it like goes back to the Brooklyn Dodgers, like of the turn of the century. I mean, there's home plate from Ebbets Field. There's the bass drum from the band. Everything's dusty. There's files all over the place.
Yeah.
And it just blew my mind. So what was the condition of a lot of these artifacts? I mean, first of all, I got to hear about the waffle iron, right? You got to tell me that story, because
that was surreal. That was
yeah.
one of my more surreal phone calls. But yes.
Yeah.
So to answer your first question, so again, we had an archive in place from in the late 70s, and it really ramped up. Well, throughout the 80s, but then in the 90s, when we opened up the Nike Town stores, and we opened up the World Campus also in 1990. So there was a real influx and a need for materials to display in these buildings. And again, once you've acquired them, you don't want to just, to your point, shove them in a box or put them out and get all dusty. So we have a system in place, and we have a very large warehouse where we keep all the materials in high density shelving, and they're all scanned, and they're all cataloged, and we're radio frequency IDing them all. So it's all very well kept.
Yeah.
As I said, my only real contribution was that we needed the glue between them, the stories between the items. But yes, it is all internal only, which is kind of unfortunate, because these things are essentially not on display in like these amazing display cases, where you could walk through and do like a self-guided tour of Nike history. We can do that, and we have some. I can go into that later. We do have ways that we can put them on display within our building, but it's not the same like you would get an experience at the Smithsonian or as an exhibit.
Yeah.
So yes, so the waffle iron, right? So again, I started the position in 2005, and one of the first questions I got almost out of the gate was, "That's really cool, but do you have this? Do you have that?" And everything was always like, "Where's the original waffle iron?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I don't know. I've not seen it. No one's mentioned that we have it in the archive." And so I actually called Barbara Bowerman, right, the widow of Bill Bowerman, who ruined the first waffle iron back in 1971. And Barbara laughed, and she said, "Oh, I threw that away." And I said, you threw it away?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I mean, it was glued shut. Bill didn't put a releasing agent on the waffle thing, on the two ends of the waffle. So when he put the urethane or whatever, the mixture inside, and heated it up, it basically was solidly frozen, in place. So because I threw it away. And, you can't really blame her. In 1971, nobody had any idea that the waffle would inspire what it did and create the waffle outsole and the waffle train and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, right.
So I shrugged, and I was like, "Oh, shoot." So again, but over and over again, I kept getting that question. So finally, I got Barbara on tape, right? Because she lived up in Fossil before she passed away, and that's in Central Oregon. It's about a 3-hour drive. So I wanted to get up there and really just do the whole interview with her. And then she went through the whole story again. And she pointed her finger. It's like a 90-year-old bony finger. And she points it right at me, and she said, "You tell Nelson Ferris and everyone else that I was there that morning that Bill glued the waffle iron together. Everybody says I was at church because it was a Sunday, and I normally went to church. But I was there." And so I took that like as a holy, I mean, she was the nicest lady I've ever met. And she's like insisting that her role in this story be told. So I'm
Right.
like, absolutely, I will absolutely tell this story correctly.
Yeah.
So that I'm thinking like, well, that's my one contribution I can do to this to improve the story.
Mhm.
And then I kind of forgot about it again because the Waffle Iron was thrown away.
Yeah.
So I get a call in 2010, maybe early 11, from one of the Bowerman family members saying that that Barbara had since passed recently, and that Tom, one of their sons, was now living on the Bowerman property in Coburg outside of Eugene, which is where Bill had done all his tinkering when he was at U of O.
Mm.
And they said that Tom's expanding the carport where Bill did a lot of his shoe work. And he got a backhoe and he dug out the area next to the carport because they wanted to lay a foundation, to extend it. And when the backhoe dropped, what was in it, a bunch of old shoes fell out and old metal plates and a waffle iron.
No way.
And I know. And I was like, wait a minute, what now? And she said, no, there's the waffle iron. And she said, we've had it for a number of months, but we weren't sure what to do with it. But I ran it by Barbara and I showed it to her, and she confirmed that was the original one.
Wow.
And I'm like, is this real? Is this? So I said, well, how could that be? I mean, this was 1971. It's almost 40 years now.
Yeah.
And she said, well, they live, and I knew where they live because I've been there a couple of times. And she said, they live on the top of this hill with a bunch of switchbacks getting up. They don't have garbage trucks that service them. They would either burn what they could burn or bury what they couldn't, or haul off the larger stuff. And she said there was a series of rubbish pits in their side yard, in the backyard, that would be filled with things like waffle irons and other hard goods that couldn't burn. Yeah. And once they were filled, they would fill them up with dirt, cover them up, and then dig another hole. So when Barbara said she threw away the waffle iron, what she meant was she threw it into the rubbish bin right outside their carport. Oh. And it was in there, interred under the ground for almost 40 years. But I guess because there was no oxygen getting there, even though we have rain here all the time, it didn't completely destroy a metal. I mean, the rest of the framework's gone, but the metal is intact. It's very, very brittle. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah. So they were trying to decide what to do with it. And they suggested they were going to auction it off and raise money for a track program they were trying to rebuild near Fossil. And I just said, can we work out a deal where we'll donate to your cause, and then you'll just give us the waffle iron. It just makes things a lot easier that way. And she agreed to it. So wow, they delivered this really, really old, metally, crappy, rusty waffle iron, and it's one of the most amazing artifacts we have in our collection.
That is amazing. And how is it preserved? Do you have it like in a glass case or something, or how is it?
It's in a glass case. We've talked about encasing it in lucite. I mean, trying to do something to preserve it, but that's no return on that, right? I mean, you do that, it's done. Yeah. So we're just very careful with it. That was one of the artifacts we did have on display within the Nike campus. It was in Steve Prefontaine Hall, which was one of the original reception areas on the campus. The Prefontaine Hall is under renovation right now. So now the waffle iron is in a quiet, dark resting place within the archive building, waiting to decide whether we're going to put it back out on display or what we're going to do with it. Because again, every time we move it, you notice a few more little pieces of metal on the bottom of the tray, because it was for, it was a wedding gift, which we also found out it's an Art Deco waffle. It looks really cool. We've been able to find some of its brothers and sisters from the 30s. Yeah. And it was a really cool looking waffle iron. It was a wedding gift they got in the early 30s that lasted almost 40 years until Bill decided it was going to be used for his epiphany.
Unbelievable. So literally the first Nike shoes with the waffle bottom, right, were made from a mold that Bill Bowerman did from that waffle iron. I mean, who had any idea that it would lead what Nike became? Right.
It was just for clarity. It was inspired by it. Was actually inverse of the waffle, but it was the idea of those chambers and so he reversed it and turned it into essentially the idea. But the idea came to him over breakfast.
Unbelievable. That is truly a story in sports that it's got to be up there in one of the top 10 of untold stories, or people just are mind blown when they hear it. It's crazy.
Well, as the Nike historian, right? I mean, I told the reporter from the Oregonian when I spoke with her, I just said, to me, this is like the Holy Grail, right?
Yeah,
I mean, for Nike.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean,
Right.
some people are like, "Oh, how can you compare that to the Holy Grail?" I'm like, I'm not talking about the Holy Grail. I'm talking about, to me, as Nike's historian, to get the Waffle Iron
Yeah.
resurrected literally from the ground. It is kind of like our Holy Grail.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I go to Springfield to the Naismith Hall of Fame. I see the original peach basket. I mean, the game started there.
Right.
That was the first ball was thrown into that thing, and
Right.
it had a bottom to it. So I don't know how
Yeah.
they scored like 3 points in the game, but it was crazy, right? So unbelievable. That's such a great story. So can you I'm not clear on how Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight actually met. I know
Mhm.
Phil was a runner, Bill was a coach, but how did that meeting happen?
So Phil was a runner, yes, at the University of Oregon, ran for Bill. Phil got to University of Oregon in 1955. At that time, freshmen really didn't compete. So he was mostly the freshman year. He was mostly, well, they don't really have a bench, but he wasn't really
Yeah.
a part of the full team. Over the next 3 years, he obviously got to know Bill. Phil was a good runner, never a great one, and he's the first to admit that.
Mhm.
But he tried really hard, right? He was really motivated to do his best. He's very competitive, very competitive. Um,
Mhm.
and he just looked at Bill as somewhat of a father figure, even though he had a great relationship with his dad. It was still somewhat of a father figure with Bill. So in his senior year, 1958, there's a letter that I found from Bill to Phil saying, when you come down this fall, or send me your shoes I want to make some modifications. And so for the next year or so, 58, 59, Phil wore a couple of modified shoes that Bill was tinkering with. So this was Bill's initial efforts into modifying existing shoes. And just to back up, there's a little misunderstanding about Bill. Bill was never really that critical of footwear,
Mhm.
the running footwear of the 1950s. A lot of people say that he didn't like what was being made. That's not necessarily true. It was more he didn't like the cost. He wanted to buy it directly from the manufacturers and not go through middleman.
Mhm.
There's several letters that he wrote to Adi Dassler and to others, basically saying, I'd like to buy shoes directly from you, and I've got some ideas if you're interested. And invariably, everybody responded with, thank you for your interest. Our dealer in the United States is so and so, and they didn't even mention anything about his shoe designs.
Mhm.
So Bill was getting more and more frustrated with that.
Mhm.
So, so Phil then graduates in 1959, goes in the military for a brief term, finally decides he wants to go back to school, goes to Stanford to get his master's degree. And he writes a paper in a class on entrepreneurship. Basically, it's the assignment was to write a business plan for a business that does not exist. So Phil drew from his knowledge of Bill and footwear development, and then he cross-referenced that with the growing number of Japanese-made cameras and how they were being made less expensively, but with the same amount of quality as the much more established but expensive German cameras.
Mhm.
So Phil did kind of like the Reese's peanut butter cup, a little chocolate, little peanut butter brought together. It's like, okay, footwear, Japan versus Germany, and created a whole business plan that said you could make, or he postulated that you could make running shoes that would be equal to or better than the existing German shoes if you made them in Japan
Mhm.
at a lower cost. So all these things are coming together. Phil then goes to Japan in November of 1962, BS's his way into a meeting with Onitsuka, which is the maker of Tiger brand running shoes, and comes out of it essentially as the West Coast distributor for Tiger brand running shoes. But he was still on his round the world trip after he graduated Stanford.
Yeah.
So he just said, well, here's my address and please send me the samples. And like for a year, he never got the samples. It was over. In fact, it was almost a year and a month, 13 months
Mhm.
where he got the samples. So he gets the samples in December of 63, and he sends a couple pairs to Bill because he's basically looking for kind of an easy sale, right? I mean, it's his old coach. He's
Mhm.
just down the highway from him. Obviously, Bill's endorsement would be valuable. Bill at the University of Oregon had won the NCAA tournament in 1962, so he's a hot commodity.
Mhm.
So Phil's thinking like, if I could just get him at cost, if I could just sell them shoes at cost, it's be a great opportunity. But so what Phil didn't know was this whole backstory with Bill. So Bill gets these shoes, and he's thinking like, oh yeah, these shoes would be good, and I could certainly see having our people wear them. But he's already thinking, oh, this would also be an opportunity or an access point to me to a manufacturer of footwear, of athletic footwear that he's never been able to get any no pun intended traction with in the German groups. So he sends a note back to Phil saying, not only will I buy some of these shoes from you, but I'd like you to cut me in as a partner, which was not Phil's intention at all. So Phil was blown away. You know, his old mentor, his old track coach actually wants to be a partner with him. Yeah. So the two meet later that week, in January 25th, 1964. They meet at a hotel outside of the Memorial Coliseum in Portland, and they basically talk about terms and issues and things that they want to do, and they shake hands, and that became Blue Ribbon Sports. Literally, in the span of a letter sent on January 20th to Bill, a response 2 days later to Phil, and after a span of 5 days, they're partners, and they're starting off this company called Blue Ribbon Sports.
Wow.
So it was all these factors that had to come together, right? Bill had to have this desire to have footwear manufactured under his auspices, and that's what ended up happening. So he, you know, he immediately gets to connect with the Onitsuka people. They start sending them his ideas that ultimately became the Cortez running shoe, which, you know, was the iconic shoe for Nike in the very early days, and it's still one of our most popular shoes. But that was all Bill and his ideas and his changes to the existing Tiger shoes. He took a couple of Tiger shoes, took some of this and some of that, and then he added his own goodness to the design. And lo and behold, you come up with the Cortez, which had the first full-length midsole in a shoe, had the heel wedge in the back, so it put less pressure on your Achilles. I mean, all these things that are standard now.
Yeah.
Were ideas that Bill had running around in his head, but he had no access to an Adidas or a Puma or anybody to get them to make these changes.
What an incredible marriage of two incredible minds, right? I mean, Phil seemed like sort of the entrepreneur business guy.
Yep.
Bill seemed like more of the technical sort of product guy, right? Who also had an entrepreneurial spirit. And I mean, it probably wasn't a perfect marriage for all those years that they worked together, but like any marriage, I mean, look what they created, the children that they made together, you know, the company that they built, unbelievable. So Blue Ribbon stayed Blue Ribbon until 71, is that right? When it was renamed?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but yeah. So Blue Ribbon Sports, the first roughly 9 years of the company's existence, 8 years.
Yeah.
Blue Ribbon Sports was the U.S.-based distributor for Tiger running shoes, and some other smaller product lines, but essentially Tiger running shoes. And then in 1971, let me back up. So there were basically a series of 3-year contracts between Blue Ribbon Sports and Onitsuka. And in 1969, they signed yet another update. But over the next couple of years, Phil started getting wind that the Onitsuka was now looking around for other distributors. So I think they felt that Blue Ribbon was too powerful, they wanted to have more diversity in the United States, which would have been a violation of the contract. They could have waited till the end of 72, of course, and then just not renewed, but they didn't. And so Phil got nervous that they were going to have their essentially a big legal battle and be essentially cut off. So he decided that the only way for Blue Ribbon Sports to be successful in the long haul would be for the company to have and market its own brand. So in early 1971, he went to a factory, or he met with a factory that makes shoes in Mexico, because he knew Japan was too small of a town, if you will. You know, people would know. So he went to Mexico and found a company there, and they manufactured a soccer boot that they sold in the 1970 Mexico City World Cup. And so they basically was a black shoe with no mark on it, and so they needed a mark and they needed a name for the shoe. And then so in 71, that's when the name, first that's when the swoosh came about.
Yeah.
That was in probably March or April. I can't find any records. I've never been able to find like a document saying, well, we picked this mark, you know, so I've had to do a lot of what I used to call CSI Beaverton, you know, trying to put this stuff together. But I believe the mark was selected in March or early April of 71.
Yeah.
And that was immediately sent down to Mexico to be created and affixed to these shoes. So, okay, you got a shoe, it's got a chubby white check mark on it, and now we're going to send it to market, but we can't just call it the shoe, right? It's not just the soccer cleat. So it had to be named something. And that's when Jeff Johnson, Nike's first employee, woke up in the morning with the name Nike on his mind and submitted it to Phil and to others. And Phil said, I don't really like it, but maybe it'll grow on me. And so that was the first shoe, was the Nike. So a lot of people confuse, because the name Nike shows up in 71. People sometimes think that was when the company changed its name. But in 1971, we were still distributing Blue Ribbon Tiger shoes for Nitska as Blue Ribbon Sports.
Right.
So the Nike shoe, the Nike cleat,
Uh-huh.
it was successful in that we sold a lot of them, but we also had to take a lot of them back because they were made in Mexico, deep south in Mexico. The plate was very brittle in the cold. So when we sold a lot of shoes in New England, and a lot of football and lacrosse and soccer players were wearing them in the fall of 71, they started to crack, and people started sending them back.
Yeah.
So the Nike shoe itself has unfortunately a very short life, but the name Nike stuck.
Yeah.
So when Phil and Bill and Jeff Johnson and others were getting the first line of Nike products to sell with the swoosh on them, running shoes, others at the NSGA and SGA trade show in Chicago in February of 72, the name Nike was then transferred. So it's now the Nike Cortez, the Nike Boston. So Nike became the name of the line, or the brand of shoes. Still not the name of the company. We're still Blue Ribbon Sports. So it's funny because this is probably, reporters especially ask me about this, and I start going into the explanation. You can just see their eyes glaze over.
No,
your listeners are probably like, "Oh my god!"
No, I love it. So a couple of facts there. Then, so 71, the Nike shoe comes out. It's a cleat, right? So it's not the running shoe that we all think of. The Nike started with running shoes, not really, right? Because the Nike shoe is a cleat, right?
Right, because the contract that we had signed with Onitska, which was faltering but still in place, said that we could not create a competing running shoe. It did not say anything about any other sport.
Right. So Jeff Johnson thinks of this name. Nike is the goddess of victory, the Greek goddess of victory, right?
Yes.
So that made sense. Brilliant, by the way. And then tell me about Carol Davidson. Carolyn Davidson.
Carol, she is one of the nicest people I've ever met. So she was going to the university, Portland State University in 1969. Yeah. And Phil at that time, and this is another thing a lot of people don't realize, Phil and Bill, from 1964 when they shook hands until 1969 when Phil stepped away from accounting, they were both part-time mentor or leaders of Blue Ribbon Sports, because Bill was the track coach at the University of Oregon, and he had a full-time job, and Phil was working for a couple different accounting firms. So Phil would basically try to keep Blue Ribbon Sports moving in his free time, his lunch hours, anytime he could find it. And Jeff Johnson was doing all the heavy lifting because he was the only full-time employee. So he's the one opening the first retail store, shooting the photographs and creating the catalog and creating the mailing list and doing the mail order business and I mean, warehousing. I mean, Jeff, I called Jeff, I said, you're like the headwater of almost every department at Nike, right? I mean, everybody can call you their ancestor. Right. So Jeff's getting all that done. So in 69, Phil is still an assistant professor at Portland State teaching accounting. He's walking through the hallways and he passes this couple of young ladies that are sitting against the wall between classes. And he overhears one of them say something about how she needs to find a little extra work for something. They disagree. Carolyn and Phil disagree over what it was she wanted the money for. Yeah. But he overheard enough that he came back and he said, excuse me, are you the one who's looking to earn a little extra money? And she said, yes. And so he explained what he did. And he said, I'm looking for a graphic student, a graphic design person who can help me create brochures and charts and things like that for my business. So Carolyn started working for him on a spot basis whenever he needed, and that was 69. So 71, March or so of 71, they need to come up with a brand mark, and Phil asked Carolyn if she could come up with some different ideas, and he gave her some vague direction. It's got to be kind of like it has to be recognizable. It would be great if it would connote or show motion of some kind. Again, the stories vary a little bit with whoever tells it. Yeah. So she went away for a few days and came back with a few designs, and Bob Waddell, who's employee number 4, Jeff Johnson, employee number 1, Phil, and Carolyn were the people in the room, right? And she showed them, and they were all like, nah. So Carolyn went, okay. So she went back and did another rendition, came back a couple weeks later, And again, they went, nah, nah. And so the swoosh was one of those. And they basically, again, Phil famously also said roughly the same thing, like, well, I don't like it. Maybe it'll grow on me or something like that.
Yeah. But
And at that point,
they needed a mark. They had to get something
yeah,
on
at that
shoe.
point, the shoes are being were being readied in Mexico, and they were ready to go. So they had to get moving on it. So they took the swoosh, and they, in the back of their heads, are like, well, this will be fine to get started. We can always come up with something better later. So Carolyn, and she charged $35, which again, another
$35.
yeah, she did work at $2 an hour. Again, this is the 70s.
Oh my God.
And so everybody assumed she worked for 17 and a half hours. And she told me that's not true. She said, I've never really built anybody for a thing like that. I just figured that was roughly worth $35.
Oh my
so
God. Yeah,
that's what she asked for. And I asked her, I said, did you save your invoice? She said no. Again, little things like that would be so cool to have in the archive.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Just one nice footnote to that, though, ever. In 1983, Carolyn was invited to a luncheon out at the Nike headquarters and was given a gold ring with a swoosh gold ring and a diamond on it, and then a packet of Nike stock, which she has never divulged how much was there. Phil said a couple times what he said was in there, but she's never said how much. But it was, she always used to tell me, I'm doing all right. So that I was like, okay, they did right by her, because $35, even though no one knew at the time that was going to be the one of the most recognized brands in the world, it was still $30.
But I'm glad they took care of her, because wow, that's incredible. So many other things, Scott, we can talk about. I mean, Mark told me, the great story about how he really invented the championship hat, which has now become standard. That's such a great story. He talked to us about getting sued by the Beatles, by Yoko for using Revolution in the first Beatles ad, song that was used in an 87. A couple other tidbits, though, stuff that we researched. I mean, you got to tell us where Just Do It came from. I mean, I know because I researched it, and I still can't believe it, but is it true?
Well, it's Dan Wyden told me it, and he was the one that came up with it. So if it's as true as Dan's memory. But so 1987, you mentioned Revolution and the Beatles ad. You're right. It's an international sensation or abomination, depending on your point of view. We were sued. That was a long story. It was obviously eventually settled, and we were fine. We didn't have to pay any money because we had secured the rights. And I don't need to go back and all that again.
Yeah.
But so the point of where you are now is, okay, well, that was last year. Now what are you going to do for us, Nike advertising? So we've only created an ad that the entire world has remarked on, and now we want something as a follow-up. So there was an ad put together celebrating Hayward Field, right, which is the home of the University of Oregon track. It's essentially sort of our unofficial birthplace because of Steve Prefontaine, Phil, Bill, et cetera. So Hayward Field holds a very high emotional connection to Nike employees. It doesn't, however, really necessarily resonate with the entire country or the entire world. So the ad that was put together and shown at a sales meeting was essentially a voice of God talking about Hayward Field, and a very slow pan. It was beautifully shot. But when you're expecting Revolution and the Beatles, and you get this, it's just in other words, thump. It didn't really wow people. So they go into somewhat of a high, not panic, but essentially like, okay, we need to come up with something else. So Dan and Dave Kennedy and the rest of their creative team was essentially charged very quickly with coming up with something else. So they put together a bunch of different ads with a bunch of different, almost a lot of them were everyday people, just different people doing different things, but nothing. According to Dan, there was really no there was no connecting, there was no tie. So he felt, even though he's told me he was kind of really anti-slogan or anti-tags, he felt the ad needed something that would tie it together, because you got, Walt Stack running across the Golden Gate Bridge with his teeth in a jar back in his locker, and you've got a dog chasing after a hydrant and wanting to stop, but his runner won't stop because she's enjoying the run. Those don't really connect, in terms of like they don't build on each other.
Right.
So he came up first with Do It, kind of a imperative, do it, but that sounded almost a little bit too bossy. And so then he started thinking about, let me back up. So he remembered, because Dan's mind worked this way. He remembered there was a serial killer, a mass murderer. Was it? I'm totally blanking now. Is it
Gary Gilmore?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Boy, when the historian starts losing his memory, that's not a good thing. And Gilmore's final words before he was going to be put to death were very defiant. He basically said, "Let's do it," and
Yeah.
that stuck with Dan. And he felt like, wow, if you're going to face that, and the guy's got the resolve to say, "Let's do it."
Yeah.
He liked the idea, but he felt, "Let's do it." First off, I don't think he wanted to quote specifically a serial killer, so he changed it to "just do it" because it was a little softer than "do it." It's not like "do it."
Yeah. Right.
So he changed it to "just do it," and that became the thread that all the ads had a message to, and that's literally been. I mean, you look at some of the other tags we've done over the years, and other brands have done over the years, and frankly, they're all derivations in most cases of "just do it."
Unbelievable. So the company starts with a waffle iron. A serial killer gives you the logo. A college student invents the swoosh for $35, right? And you get sued by the Beatles. I mean, how could there be any more colorful history of a mega company to document than that? I mean, what an incredible run. I mean, an incredible story. And so your basically your timeline, all the research you did really contributed directly to Phil Knight's memoir, Shoe Dog, right? I mean, almost verbatim.
Well, it did. So Shoe Dog, let me back up. So the timeline was something that I created from scratch. There were existing timelines that when I first took over the role or started the role of historian, I would go through some of the timelines and I would see inaccuracies. And I was like, wait a minute, that's not right. I mean, one of the first ones said that Phil and Bill met in 1957. And I knew that wasn't true because Bill, it was just one of those things like, I'm like, and this timeline was from like 1973. Right. So it's like Phil was probably just down the hall. You could just yell down the hall, "Hey, Phil, when did you first meet Bill?" 55. So I was like, well, that's wrong. And I saw something else. I'm like, that's not right. And so I started going through the early timelines and I thought, well, what else is wrong? So I decided at that point, I'm starting a new timeline from scratch. I will not put anything in this timeline that I can't verify through either evidence from without like newspaper articles or memos, etc. And so I built that up over time, and it's just a Word document. It's just something I would keep as somewhat of a cheat sheet, and enough people wanted it that we posted it internally so everybody can go. But it's like 70 pages, a 70-page Word document. It just goes through the entire decades, decade by decade by decade. And it's not everything. I mean, you can't put every shoe launch or every athlete's accomplishment, but I tried to be judicious. And so when Phil calls me in November of 2012, and he says, I decided to do my memoir. And I was over the moon, right? Because I've been after him for years to write a book, because there's all these other unauthorized books, but nobody's actually really done it from Phil's standpoint. I was like, oh my God, that's fantastic. He said, I'm going to come over. So he comes over to the archives and we sit down. He said, okay, tell me more about what you have here, because I'm trying to resurrect, piece together memories from, 50 plus years ago. And I said, well, we have dozens of letters that you wrote to, or mostly that Jeff Johnson wrote to you in the 60s, a handful that you wrote back to him, which is mentioned in the book rather frequently because Phil was not a good letter writer. I said, we've got this, and this. And I pulled out as many things as I could from those eras, including old mailers and catalogs, etc. And I said, and I've also got this timeline. And he riffled through the first few pages of it. Excuse me. And he riffled through the first few pages of it. He goes, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. I remember this. Oh yeah, I like that. And he goes, can I take this? And I said, yeah, you can take that, Bill.
It is your history. Yeah, you could.
Yeah, exactly. So he told me later, he said that would help him provide some of the backbone to build out of, right? Because then he could look at that and go, oh yeah, I forgot that story came in. And again, after years and years and years, a person's general memory, you start conflating things, you get things out of order. Absolutely. And so the first draft of Shoe Dog was like that. He had several things that were like, no, this actually happened then, that happened then. And so it wasn't wrong. It was just out of general order. And so Phil asked me to be one of the editors of the book. And that was, again, my absolute privilege, because this, for me, I knew whatever he wrote, whatever the final book contained, would become canon, right? I mean, it would be hard to argue that this happened this way or that happened that way. Well, it says in Shoe Dog, I'm like, yeah, it does. So I was taking it very seriously. And Phil even told me a couple times when I was going not hammer and tong, but I was politely disagreeing with what he had recollected or written. And he said, "Why are you fighting me so much on this?" And I said, "For that reason." I said, "Phil, whatever you end up putting in here will be the gospel."
Right.
So as the historian for the company,
Yeah.
I have to at least do my best effort to persuade you that what I have is more accurate. And for the most part, to his credit, he agreed. A couple times he wouldn't, and then he reminded me his name was on the book, and I'm like, okay.
It's like
His name is also on my paycheck, so
yeah,
okay, you win.
yeah. I had similar experience to my dad. May he rest in peace. All his stories over the years, became a little different. The timeline,
Yes,
the people who were there were different, the situation, and we just kind of let it go. It's like, all right,
right.
he enjoys telling the story like it is. But if we were going to write it down, family history, I want it to be as accurate as possible, and that's what you did. So
Right, and
kudos
I'm
to you.
one of those fortunate people with
Yeah,
a Fortune 500 company that's been around for a while that has access to
yeah,
the founder, or at least the first generation, if you will.
absolutely.
We're not, like, well, I've got a good friend, Levi, who does I do Levi Strauss. Obviously, he died years ago. Coca-Cola, Anheuser-Busch people that I'm
Hmm.
friends with that have similar jobs to mine. They don't have access to their founders, or even their founders next generation.
No,
I do for the most part, except for Bill Bowerman and a handful of people. So
yeah.
to me, I'm like, I cannot waste
Hmm.
this opportunity. We have got to get it right. Well, we can talk to Phil. Well, we can
Yeah.
talk to Jeff.
Yep.
And so that's been like almost like a sacred mantra that we've got to get to these people and get their stories, because once they go, they take them with them.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a conversation I had with David Stern in 1985, I think, when he wanted to create an archive of photography that goes back to the beginning of time. They didn't have anything. They had, a filing cabinet with stuff, stuck in it, but there was no real archive. And there was some stories here and there. And so my good friend Terry Lyons, who you might know from the NBA, from those, he and I started NBA photos. He started
Oh,
collecting all the written stuff. I started to help with the visual stuff, and then moving forward, of course, NBA photos now is the archive for the history of the league. So I get it. I know how important it was.
right.
And David wasn't the founder, so to speak, but he felt that it was his responsibility at that time when the league was, going to make the big jump, that it had to be preserved and archived. So,
Sure.
Scott, we could talk for like hours and hours, just like with Mark.
I'm retired, man. I got all day.
I'm coming. First of all, I'm coming up to go fishing with Mark, so we're gonna bring you with us. I don't know if you fish. I don't fish, but Mark does. But this was so fascinating for me. I got to tell you, you interview a lot of people in sports, owners, athletes, writers, journalists, whatever. But meeting somebody like you who has been on the inside, like the gatekeeper of such incredible history in our business. It's really fascinating. And thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm thankful to have the chance to let more people know that this exists, because our Nike's history and heritage are they're so rich,
Yeah.
they're so
Yeah.
deep, the culture,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
having a little bit of mystery is great,
Hmm.
but having it completely locked away, and not having people have the opportunity to really draw
Yeah.
from it, to me
Yeah.
was just unconscionable, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially employees, you want employees to know. As I
Hmm.
mean, the company turns 50 on May 1st,
Wow.
right? So
Yeah.
you want the people who have been hired, or in even the 21st century, right? I mean, everyone hired in the 21st century was hired after Bill Bowerman had
Wow.
passed away.
Amazing.
So when you take, I keep reminding folks of that, especially the longer tooth folks, that there's a lot of people here who they don't remember when Phil Knight was CEO.
Yeah, that's
That was
crazy.
2004,
Yeah, I know.
right? So
Yeah.
it's very easy as you get into your daily tracks, and you
Sure.
kind of move forward. You don't realize,
Mhm.
especially the folks who've been around for a while, that there are a lot of people here who don't have that frame of reference. And what I'm thankful for is they hunger for it. They want to know. They
Mhm.
want to know on whose shoulders they stand. They want to know what happened and how this evolved. So we're at the Pegasus
Mhm.
37 now, or 38, where we're at, in
Yeah.
terms of Pegasus. Well,
Yeah.
what was the Pegasus One? And when they find out that Mark Parker, our former CEO, designed the Pegasus One,
Yeah.
they're like, really? So it's
Yeah.
when you get to see that on a daily basis, that discovery, that connectivity,
Yeah.
you feel so good, because that the company's like over 70,000 employees now, right?
Crazy. Yeah.
So how
Amazing.
do you feel
Yeah.
like a full member of a community when you're in God knows how many hundred plus countries,
Mhm.
70,000 employees?
Mm.
But if you can find this connectivity point of our heritage and history,
Mhm.
then you feel a little bit more tethered to what's going on. So to me, that what my staff and I do or did
Yeah.
just had so much. It was just so gratifying.
Yeah. Well, it's gratifying for me to be able to hear this from you directly. And I'm going to just go back to the last thing I'm going to say is, finally I went to Dodger Stadium after years of not working there, and I ended up going to a game, and there was all those artifacts that I had seen in that like sort of basement, forgotten about place, displayed beautifully around the club level and celebrated, right? So all I have to say is, as a sports fan, somebody in our business, if there's ever a Nike museum, count me in. I'm there. All right. We'll do a podcast, you and I directly. You and I and Mark will do a podcast
Yeah,
from the museum, because I think the world needs to see this stuff. So hopefully down the road, who knows?
I'd
Nike.
love it.
We'll open
I've
the
already
door.
told them I'll be their docent or what. I'll
Yeah.
take tickets to the front door, whatever.
There you go. Well, Scott, I can't thank you enough, man. And I really, really appreciate you sharing all of this. It was fascinating for us to do the research and then to meet you in person. And, I hope this started of a long friendship that we can have and come back to you about some things about Nike as we move forward with Legends of Sport. So
Absolutely. So, like I said, 50th anniversary is coming up. So, if you want to do a little dive into Nike's first or half century, then I'm here.
that would be amazing. So I'll take you up on that. Thanks so much. And
Okay.
thanks for helping out Veronica and responding. You're always so great about responding. And I'm so happy we got to talk today. So thank you.
Likewise. Take care.
Take care. Stay well. Happy New Year.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Well, folks, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation with Scott Reames and gained some insight into his career at Nike, as well as some history of the legendary company he spent 29 years working for. Thanks to our good friend, former podcast guest, and former Nike of Scott's, Mark Tomashow, for helping to make this interview happen. Thanks, as always, to my producer and head researcher, Veronica Ahn. Folks, remember you can find us on the iHeart app and online, as well as Apple and Spotify and all your favorite podcast platforms. Keep following us on Instagram at Legends of Sport, our Twitter at Legends_of Sport, our website, legendsofsport.net, and our YouTube and TikTok channels, Legends of Sport. My photography can be found on Instagram and Twitter at ADB Photo Inc. So we'll be back next week with another great guest and another great episode. So thrilled that we can be bringing these podcasts to you every single week. So keep supporting us and tell your friends. Until then, stay safe and stay well.